Talofa, my name is Tim Tufuga. This is a retake because I've had problems with breakdown in the link onto YouTube for some bizarre reason. Right, it's the 21st of January 2014. It's only 5 days away from White Australia Day, which is of course New South Wales Day, and not Australia Day, because Australia Day is January the 1st, 1901. But regardless, Captain Arthur Phillips hoisted the flag on the 26th of January, declaring the penal colony of New South Wales as a penal colony of the British Crown. Now, that was in 26th of January 1788. Now, of course, people like to celebrate White Australia Invasion Day, and much to the consternation of the Aborigines of Australia. But you get that. So in the meantime, whilst I'm unemployed now, I've had to go to Centrelink to claim the dole, and apparently they didn't want to pay me. So I assume that it's the Liberal National Party's ultra-conservative response to my non-conformity. So I'm now going to talk to you about the Australian Constitution, and I'm gonna make things a bit more a bigger picture perspective in terms of racial discrimination in this country and the allegiance to an imperial monarch that is anti-Oceania and anti-Australia in the truest sense of a self-determined sovereign nation. In terms of the adherence to the common law of the English common law, which would subjugate the present Australian subjects to the British Crown and undermining the citizenry democracy of Australian citizens. So therefore, speaking of which, the Australian Constitution, in terms of racial discrimination, is in fact a constitution which entrenches and embeds racial discrimination. And I will go further to state that when Australia signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and became an adherent and sought to ratify and assent the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, it was indeed considered, and it still is considered, as unconstitutional for Australia to partake in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So long as the Australian Constitution stands, it is unconstitutional for Australia to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with specific regards to the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Now, what is even more unconstitutional was the ratification and the assent of the passing of the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 and the Racial Vilification Act of 1994 that was passed by Michael Lavarch and the Labor government of the Keating administration. Now, in terms of racial discrimination, even the referenda pertaining to the Aboriginality or the Aboriginal enfranchisement could be deemed, well, unconstitutional until it was passed through a referendum. But according to the Australian Constitution, all forms of the elimination of racial discrimination is deemed to be unconstitutional. So, in terms of draconian laws pertaining to the founding fathers of this country who wrote the Australian Constitution, the Australian Constitution was actually smack bang in your face to the American Constitution and the belief of the all men are regarded as equals. Now, according to the Australian Constitution, that was not the case. Now, if we would refer to the Australian Constitution under Part 3 of the Australian Constitution, the House of Representatives, under Section 25, for the provision as to races disqualified from voting. For the purpose of the last section, if by the law of any state all persons of any race are disqualified from voting at elections for the more numerous house of the Parliament of the state, then in reckoning the number of the people of the state or of the Commonwealth, persons of that race resident in that state shall not be counted. Now, that is the Australian Constitution. Now, under Section 51, subsection 26, the people of any race for whom it is deemed it is necessary to make special laws, and under Section 51, subsection 30, with relations of the Commonwealth with the islands of the Pacific. Now, in this regard, the Australian Constitution legitimizes racial discrimination as per Section 25 and Section 51, subsection 26 and 30. Now, if that were considered constitutional, then it is okay for Australia to regard certain races to be disenfranchised and excluded, and that the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights pertaining to the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, which was ratified by Australia in 1948, the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975, and the Racial Vilification Act of 1994, are considered as unconstitutional according to Section 25 and Section 51, subsection 26 of the Australian Constitution, as well as Section 51, subsection 30, with regards to Pacific Islanders. Now, in those most important founding documents and laws of this country, the Australian Constitution actually would legitimize racial discrimination. It is embedded in the Australian Constitution. Now, that is reflective with many of the laws that have been derived from the Australian Constitution, with specific regards to the White Australia policy, which was enshrined in the Pacific Islander Repatriation Act of 1901, whereby the Kanakas that were blackbirded in Queensland as cane cutters were repatriated back to Vanuatu or the New Hebrides and to the South Seas whence they came from. Of course, many remained and hidden away in central Queensland and throughout Queensland as we know it today. Now, I have considered the present Australian government's amendment of the Australian Constitution to recognise the Indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, as something that should have been done 100 or so years ago. Now, obviously, it is late in coming, but eventually Australia will catch up to the rest of the world, and also catch up to 1948 with the with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and with specific regards to the treatment of certain races and the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Okay, the bottom line is, according to the Australian Constitution, the Racial Discrimination Act and the Racial Vilification Act is considered as unconstitutional. There you have it. So white Australia, you can be discriminatory because it's said in your constitution. There you go. Now, we need to change that for obvious reasons, so that the whole world can catch up. So that Australia could catch up to the whole world. Right. Now, I wanted to say that in response to my friend who keeps on harassing me and trolling me on the internet. I've got the latest information from him. I must have gone out with his girlfriend or his wife, because he is so persistent and tenacious. So yeah, tough luck, mate. And I must have done you something really, really bad, because you are really in my face. So mate, yeah, here's a beer for you, mate. So mate, in your face. And I hope Australia changes, because you're much too discriminatory, and the institutions are very discriminatory, and they remain so. What you have here at the moment is institutionalized racism, and they only employ sycophants, and they certainly dislike Republicans such as myself, who advocate self-determination for the citizenry democratic rights of this country, not the British subjectivity rights as most sycophants of this country are advocating. And these sycophants are gainfully employed and are partaking in all of the more equalised enjoyment of life as an Australian British subject, as opposed to a Australian citizenry rights. Okay, yeah, Maria, I'm gonna do some more for you people, man. I'm gonna do some more YouTubes just to make you happy, Yeah, Maria, go. So what? Fast.